The top story and our special focus is an issue that concerns each and every one of us. The race for a COVID-19 vaccine that's heating up by the day. Remember yesterday, American company Moderna announced its vaccine in clinical trials has shown 94.5% efficacy, even better than Pfizer's 90% last week. But today the WHO, the World Health Organization, sounded a word of caution. It said a vaccine in itself cannot end the pandemic. This amidst fears that rich nations are cornering the bulk of the vaccine doses to be produced. Meanwhile, the Russian vaccine is also in India now and all set for phase 2 and phase 3 trials. Here's a report, a status check on which vaccine is at what stage. Take a look.
The global hunt for COVID vaccine is yielding results. 2 vaccine candidates have shown encouraging late-stage trial results. Moderna has claimed its vaccine was found to be 94.5% effective in a preliminary analysis, which is similar to Pfizer's vaccine with 90% efficacy. Moderna claims its vaccine can be stored at -20 degrees Celsius compared with Pfizer's -75 degrees.
It's a really important milestone in the fight against the pandemic because it demonstrates that our vaccine, mRNA-1273, is able to prevent COVID-19 disease, including severe disease in people who've received it. It's really just a milestone, though. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Knowing the vaccine is going to be effective is great news, but we still need to complete the regulatory process.
The results have raised hopes, but most countries would still be a long distance away from getting vaccine deliveries. The reason? The rich nations have booked a bulk of the promised doses already. India is pinning hopes on vaccine candidates under trial on its soil. Serum Institute of India is conducting phase 2 and 3 trials of the AstraZeneca Oxford University vaccine. Bharat Biotech has started phase 3 clinical trials of its vaccine candidate Covaxin. The first batch of Russia's Sputnik V vaccine is likely to reach Kanpur for phase 2 and phase 3 human clinical trials.
वैक्सीन के रिसर्च के मामले में भारत के वैज्ञानिक जो है दुनिया के वैज्ञानिकों की तरह बहुत अच्छी तरह से काम कर रहे हैं। जैसे उसके जो कामयाबी के रिजल्ट्स आएंगे तो देश के सामने उनको प्रस्तुत किया जाएगा। निश्चित रूप से अगले साल के अंदर वैक्सीन आएगा और अगले साल के शुरुआती महीनों में ही आएगा।
The World Health Organization has warned that finding a vaccine in itself would not mean the end of COVID.
It's important to emphasize that a vaccine will complement the other tools we have, not replace them. A vaccine on its own will not end the pandemic.
Vaccine nationalism is the new threat that the world is facing in its war on COVID-19. Only 13% of the world's population has already ordered 51% of the doses promised. Now remember, the WHO had warned about this. The WHO had said if the rich nations corner the vaccines, then we will see the pandemic linger on till 2024. This is Aishwarya Paliwal reporting from New Delhi with camera person Sanjay Kumar.
So let's raise that big question right at the top tonight. Who is winning the race for the vaccine? Will vaccine national countries like India to the benefit of the higher income countries? Which vaccine is India's best bet at the moment? How fast can India get a vaccine? I'm going to be joined today by special guest. Professor Dr Gagandeep Kang is probably India's leading vaccine scientist, microbiologist, joins me at the moment. I'm also joined by Kirill Dmitriev. He's the CEO at RDIF, the Russian Development Investment Fund, which is driving the Russian Sputnik V vaccine, and Professor Stanley Perlman, one of the world's leading microbiologists and professor at the University of Iowa, is with us. I appreciate all of you joining us. I'll come to you, Professor Kang, in a moment for the Indian perspective. But let's go to first Kirill Dmitriev, because the big news coming in at the moment, Mr. Dmitriev, CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, is while all the attention over the last few days has been on Moderna and Pfizer, which have declared 90% efficacy, we are told that Sputnik V will also now be almost ready in a few days or few weeks. Are you also claiming 90% plus efficacy in your clinical trials, as your President Vladimir Putin seemed to suggest at the BRICS summit?
Well, so there are just 3 vaccines in the world that published preliminary clinical trial results. And we also published those results, and they show very high efficacy of 92%. And this is a number that is calculated very simply. 75% of clinical trial participants received the vaccine, but only 4 out of 20 people who've been infected were on vaccine. 16 were on placebo, which gives 92% efficacy rate on 16,000 people who've been taking the first and the second shot. So this is definitely a very good efficacy number, and our vaccine has been getting as much attention as others, also because it's based on a human adenoviral vector, which we believe is a safer and better studied approach.
We are also being told Mr. Dmitriev, that the first shipment of the Sputnik V vaccine arrived in India a few days ago. Your partnering pharmaceutical company, Dr. Reddy's of Hyderabad, and we are told now that permission to conduct human trials has been given, and the trials could happen within the next week in Kanpur. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's really a Russian-Indian vaccine that we believe Sputnik V is, because we are going to manufacture it jointly with several Indian companies, and obviously clinical trials are starting in India. So it's very much of a joint Russian-Indian effort. And not surprisingly to us, we just released results of a poll we've done in India. 60% of people in India have heard of Sputnik V. So we are starting clinical trials. India knows about our vaccine, and it's really a joint Russian-Indian vaccine that we are working on.
So you're interestingly calling it a joint Indian-Russian vaccine. Let me come to you, Professor Stanley Perlman, there at the University of Iowa. You've been monitoring closely the results of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, both claiming more than 90% efficacy. How effective and how soon do you see these vaccines being used to contain the pandemic?
Yes, well, I think that it's all very, very encouraging. The results are much better than we expected. These viruses are very protective against a disease. There's still details we need to know about the studies, and there is still questions about how long the immune response will be effective. But still, these results could not have been better at this point.
But there are concerns Professor Perlman, over the small size of the samples that Moderna has used when coming up with these efficacy results. Does that worry you, that we still don't know both how long the immunoresponse will last and whether this sample size is enough to claim that the vaccine is efficacious against coronavirus?
Well, you raise a good point. The number of people who have disease within the study is pretty small, but it's enough so that people can draw statistical conclusions from it. Initially, we didn't even think we'd get these good statistical conclusions. And we also these are more people than the original analyses thought were necessary to make a conclusion. So yes, we still have a little waiting to do. But as I said, it could not have been better from what we were hoping for. So there's still a lot of issues. One, the study, as you say, the numbers are small. We don't know how long it'll last. We still have to rev up manufacturing facilities so that you can be given enough doses can be manufactured so that people all around the world can get enough doses of this. And then, of course, with these 2 particular vaccines, because they're made from RNA, the internal structure of the virus, they need to be kept cold, which is a problem in certain parts of the world.
That's right. That is a challenge, that both Moderna and Pfizer need to be kept in extremely cold storage conditions. In Pfizer, -70, in the case of Moderna, -20. Just Mr. Dmitriev, it seems at the moment that there is competition almost between the Russians and the Americans as to who will come out with the corona vaccine first, taking us back, let's say, to the pre-Cold War era as to who will send an astronaut into space. Is there a race at the moment as to who gets the vaccine first, the Russians or the Americans?
Well, I would say it's a wrong way of looking at things. There is actually huge demand for vaccine, which is billions of doses. And there are only a few companies that can try to satisfy this demand in the beginning of the year. So right now we have manufacturing facilities to manufacture 500 million vaccines next year for 500 million people. And basically, we have demand of vaccines from 1 billion people. So there is actually much bigger demand by people for the vaccine, and I think we should all work together. And we are very happy with the results of Moderna, great results, obviously, from Pfizer. And we all live in a very interdependent world. So for us, it's very important for economic growth of Russia that the rest of the world, US, Europe grows well. So we want all of the vaccines to succeed.
You know, Mr. Dmitriev, I remember speaking to you about a few months ago, and you suggested at that time that end of November is when you would be in a position to actually start manufacturing the vaccine in India itself. Presumably, that deadline will not be met, but are you hopeful that in the next 2 months you can get all the regulatory approvals, all the trials will be completed, and possibly by early 2021, you and your partners, Dr. Reddy's, will be in position to actually bring out and distribute this Indo-Russian vaccine? Are you saying that now? Can you say that? Early 2021?
Well, we actually have vaccine already being manufactured in India right now as we speak. So we have several contract manufacturers in India who are producing the vaccine. They are producing small quantities now. They will produce larger quantities in December, and they will go to big million doses production in January. So basically it's happening right now, but yes, the clinical trials are starting. We hope for regulatory approval sooner rather than later from an Indian regulator, and India will be a great hub for our vaccine, not only producing for India, but also outside of India. But also we have very great results of the survey we've done where 80% of people in India would like to get vaccinated. So we see huge demand for vaccines in India. Actually, it's higher. We did the survey of 11 other countries, 73% they want to get vaccinated. So we see huge demand, huge interest from people all over the world, and definitely Indian vaccinations.
So are you confident, and I want to get this clear, that are you telling me actually that distribution could begin by early 2021? Because this is going to be a long and arduous process, presumably, to actually start the distribution. How confident are you, A, of the safety of it, and the ability then to scale up and distribute it by 2021? Make it accessible, make it efficacious. Are you confident or not?
Well, we are definitely very confident in both safety, because already more than 20,000 people received the first and the second shot, and by December there will be more than 35,000 people who received first and second shot. Efficacy, you already see 92%. We have another several interim data reviews, and we'll be releasing our information from those points. It's a very automatic process. As soon as we reach certain number of infected patients, we just release the data, so this will be released. And we are very much dependent on great work with your regulator and Indian government. And Indian government have been very helpful. For example, we use some of the government biotech labs for testing of the vaccines. So we are working very closely with your regulator, and it is possible that by December, maybe January, we do get an emergency approval based on Russian data. But again, it's all subject of our work with a great regulator that you have.
Okay, so you're giving us positive news. Professor Perlman, when do you expect the large-scale distribution of, let's say, Moderna and Pfizer, given that they are operating with even stricter, some say, regulatory approvals in place yet to come?
Well, I think that I don't know what the very earliest, but I think that sometime between the end of March and May, we should have enough vaccines to be able to immunize lots of people in the world. Whether it will be everyone, I don't know. Because remember, the other thing is that what these first studies show is that the vaccines develop a good immune response. And so there's no reason to think that the other vaccines that are being studied won't also induce a good immune response. So in which case you don't depend just on the RNA vaccines. In the next few weeks, we'll know about the one from AstraZeneca. We'll know about one of the ones from Johnson & Johnson and Novavax. We should have that information by the end of January. So there may, by May or June, there may be lots of vaccines that are useful, and there therefore may be enough doses so that whether there's vaccine nationalism or not, there'll be enough doses around for the world.
Professor Perlman and Dmitriev, I appreciate your joining us and giving us a sense of this of where the Russian and the American vaccines stand at the moment. I want to turn to India. How does this now impact us in India? I'm joined by the country's leading vaccine scientist, Dr. Gagandeep Kang is joining me. She's with CMC Vellore. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Kang. I want to ask you the first question. As the world seems excited with both Moderna and Pfizer reporting more than 90% efficacy in their vaccine trials, what does this mean for us here in India? Is a vaccine around the corner? Do you share this excitement around the world at the moment? Should we be sharing it here in India?
It is a tremendously exciting time. These are completely unexpected results. I think all of us were thinking that we would have a vaccine that was 60 or 70% efficacious. And even that would have been a very, very useful tool. But to think about a vaccine that is showing at least initial results of 60 or, well, 90% now, and in fact, in the case of Moderna, we are seeing that it's preventing practically all severe disease. That's phenomenal. And I anticipate that these results should hold. It won't be perfect, but it'll be very, very, very good at protecting from disease and most likely from infection as well.
But Dr. Kang, from an Indian perspective, are you concerned that Moderna, for example, requires storage of the vaccine at minus 20 degrees and a limited shelf life of 30 hours? Pfizer, minus 75 degrees Celsius, again a limited shelf life reported to be as limited as 24 to 48 hours. Does that mean that both Moderna and Pfizer, to that extent, are not suited for Indian conditions?
They may not be suited for the Indian program, particularly the Pfizer vaccine, which requires minus 70 to minus 80 for long-term storage. The Moderna is more tractable. Minus 20 is something that we've done before for polio, and the Moderna vaccine can be kept at 2 to 8 degrees for a month. Given that the supply is going to be the critical limiting factor, I think it would be possible to cycle the Moderna vaccines sufficiently to be able to roll them out in the program. The concern with both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are the costs, because these vaccines are much, much, much more expensive than we've ever had for any vaccine in the program. It's in the several thousand rupees per dose of vaccine. So I think the excitement is we have successful vaccines and more than one. So this shows us that vaccines that are based on the spike protein of the virus are likely to work. And the emerging data on a much smaller number of patients from the Gamaleya study seems to indicate that the spike protein is working not only in the mRNA platform, but also in the adenovirus platform. If that is the case, and we are going to have multiple platforms which will give us successful vaccines, then we are in a very, very good position where prevention of disease and infection is concerned. We really have a tool that could help us handle this pandemic.
You know, you made an important point about affordability, and can I add to that, accessibility? The fear is that Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines will first be made available to America and the West as part of this vaccine nationalism, that the high-income countries have already placed orders and are cornering a major part of these vaccines. India has not signed any agreements with Moderna and Pfizer. To that extent, should we in India still be more dependent on the success either of the AstraZeneca vaccine, where Serum Institute of Pune has tied up with it, or the other indigenous vaccines, Bharat Biotech, others being developed? Do we wait for that? Or do you see us benefiting from Moderna or Pfizer by January of 2021, as America is hoping to benefit?
So if you look at the Moderna and the Pfizer results, they are not going to submit to FDA tomorrow. They have to generate safety data. This data is clinical efficacy data showing that the vaccine works, it does what it's supposed to, it's safe, it's preventing disease and it's preventing severe disease. But they are required to have at least 2 months of safety data for 50% of the people that they have recruited into their clinical trial. Those data are not yet available. Once they become available, which for Pfizer may be as early as next week, they will be going ahead to the FDA, going for an emergency use authorization. Only then will they be able to roll the vaccine out to the US. And other regulatory authorities will have to look at Pfizer and Moderna's data, see whether they are satisfied with that data, whether they want or because of their legal requirements need to do certain studies in their own populations before these vaccines can become available. So in India's case, usually we have a requirement for bridging studies in our people before we give vaccines licensure. So we'll have to wait and see what the DCGI says. And AstraZeneca is not very far behind. We will have AstraZeneca's efficacy results probably later this month or next month. And Serum Institute has already completed their immunogenicity studies. So we can bridge to the efficacy results from AstraZeneca, and we could have a licensure for AstraZeneca before we have one for Pfizer and Moderna.
So let me get it clear for our viewers. To make this clear, are we therefore looking at possibly, Dr. Kang, the AstraZeneca Oxford Serum Institute vaccine is the one which is most likely to be available in this country first, possibly by the first quarter of 2021? Am I setting an unrealistic timeline here?
Not at all. I think it's very feasible. A lot depends on AstraZeneca's phase 3 results from other parts of the world. But all the indications are that they are really, really close. And given that Serum has already completed the 1,600 volunteers and has doses already stockpiled, there is absolutely no reason why a limited supply should not become available in the first quarter if all goes well.
So you're giving us again an important news point. You believe by early quarter of 2021 for emergency use, AstraZeneca Oxford Serum should be available, all going well. I'm also told, Dr. Kang, that AstraZeneca's vaccine requires storage at -2 degrees to -8, unlike Pfizer and Moderna, which required -70 and -20. To that extent, is it therefore usable by ordinary refrigerators, does not need these high freezing conditions? Does that give a big advantage in manufacturing it at scale and importantly distributing it at scale in a country like India?
So it's actually 2 to 8, not -2 to 8. And it is your regular refrigerator has those temperatures. And yes, all of the vaccines that we have in our program currently, other than the polio vaccine that requires -20 degrees, are actually 2 to 8 vaccines. So that definitely allows us to use existing cold chain space as well as cold storage systems that may be in the private sector, because our current volume of cold chain space allows us to deliver 600 million doses of vaccine a year. Now we are talking about delivering routine immunization and on top of that, adding the immunization for SARS-CoV-2. So we will need additional cold chain capacity, and it should be relatively easy to find from the agri sector.
You know, let's come to that challenge that's going to come in distribution, because given our own track record, the vaccine industry in India, Dr. Kang, has been seen as a step ahead of most competitors in the world. Does that give us an advantage given the role that already, the experience that this country has in polio, other vaccines like cholera and typhoid? Do we have the infrastructure already in place to ensure the fast tracking distribution of the vaccine in a limited time?
So there is a difference between the ability to manufacture and the ability to deliver. So in terms of the ability to manufacture, India makes more doses of vaccines than any other country in the world. So with the large companies that we have, Serum Institute, Bharat Biotech, Biological E, all of them have vaccine candidates now that are in clinical trials for SARS-CoV-2. And I think that if we get vaccines made by them, they will scale, they have distribution systems, and these vaccines will be more suitable for programs for low and middle income countries, India, as well as other countries in the world, than the first wave of vaccines that we are seeing. So the mRNA vaccines establish the proof of principles that vaccine works. But then in terms of scale and delivery, we'll have to think about vaccines that are lower cost, can be made at higher volume, have more experience with manufacturing. So that's the manufacturing. In terms of the delivery, we don't have a delivery program other than for pregnant women when we think of adult vaccination. So here is where the challenges really are going to be in terms of logistics. Who do you give the vaccine to first? How do you document it? When it's a 2-dose vaccine, how do you do follow-up to make sure that they get it? Now, if we go to a community, how are you going to tell people, okay, your grandfather can be vaccinated now, but your father who has diabetes cannot be vaccinated because there isn't enough vaccine to give him? And children and young adults will come even after that. So we are going to have repeated waves of vaccination, depending on which the priority groups are at different times.
That's very interesting how you're putting it, the challenges that lie ahead. But am I then to believe that we may have a vaccine in the first quarter of 2021 for emergency use, but by the time the distribution happens across age groups, it might take 12 to 15 months? It will be therefore much more longer and a tedious process before every Indian can have access to the vaccine. Am I correct?
I actually think it's going to be longer than that, because if you're talking about vaccinating our entire population with 2 doses of vaccines, I think it's going to take 24 months or more. So that's why the prioritization is important, because you have to keep delivering it to different parts of the population at different times. This is going to be a huge challenge for the country and very, very complicated.
You know, obviously this is not just a challenge for India, it's a challenge for the world to make this vaccine accessible. It's coming at a time, Dr. Kang, where there is vaccine nationalism. Every country, in a sense, in this vaccine race, wanting to get the vaccine first for its own people. The higher income countries doing their own tie-ups with private vaccine companies to ensure that it reaches them first. Does this trouble you, this vaccine nationalism? Does it end up compromising safety standards, and in some instances ensuring that low-income countries, including India, and vulnerable groups don't get the vaccine as soon as they should?
I think one of the things that everyone has to realize, and maybe as scientists we have not explained this enough, that as long as you have parts of the world that are affected with SARS-CoV-2, this is a virus that travels. You're not going to be safe, really, unless you vaccinate the entire world, because 95% efficacy still means that 1 in 20 people in your completely vaccinated country are still susceptible. So vaccine nationalism is a huge concern. And I think India, as a country that manufactures vaccines, should look at its place in the world. As a global citizen, what is it that we should be thinking about? Should we be thinking about priority groups as global priority groups rather than our country's priority groups alone? So if we are vaccinating healthcare workers, I think a healthcare worker in Tonga should have the same access to a vaccine as a healthcare worker in Finland or the US. And if we think about the elderly, then again, it should be elderly across the entire world. And if India can play a role in making these vaccines available to the world, I think we should. It's very important to remember that this virus is a virus where the risks are predictable. That's why this prioritization exercise has been undertaken by WHO and global partners. Young people have very little risk of dying if they are infected with the virus. Elderly people have a lot. So therefore, you should be prioritizing people who are elderly over those who are young. And explaining this, I think, is a responsibility that we all have.
Just one final question, Dr. Kang. You know, as someone who's tracked vaccines over the years, I want to understand from you, it usually takes several years to develop a vaccine. We've seen, even with HIV, you don't even get perfection at the end of it. Now, within a year of coronavirus breaking out, the world seems almost ready with a vaccine. There are all kinds of research going on across the world. Does that fill you with a sense of pride and satisfaction as a vaccine scientist, or do you worry at times that maybe safety is going to be compromised because of the fast tracking of this entire vaccine process?
I have to admit that I was very concerned when I saw what was happening in the US. So I was very relieved when the FDA resisted the pressure to sign off on vaccines before they were good and ready to see the data. The very fact that the FDA came out with a statement saying that we have to see at least 2 months of safety data before we will review an application for emergency use authorization kind of showed that under very difficult circumstances, they were protecting their independence. And that's why regulatory authorities that are independent are critically important to protecting the public. This has been seen with what WHO is advising, no compromises on safety and making sure that there are clinical readouts for all of the vaccines. This has been a time of turmoil when we think about how vaccines are traditionally developed. It's a long, slow, sequential process. Instead, we were doing parallel processing. We were throwing everything that everybody's got at vaccine development. But the critical issue is that safety has not been compromised. The principles on which we license vaccines have not been compromised. We are getting results that give us confidence in the vaccines, and we will now not have results on certain critical parameters. Do these vaccines work in the elderly? Do they work in young people? How long will protection last? These answers will come. But I think effectively what the pandemic has done is it's catapulted the vaccine field forward by a decade. The amount of science, the amount of learning that we have had in the past year is something would have taken us much, much longer to accumulate had we gone about business as usual.
So net, Dr. Kang, are we saying that 2021 promises to be much better? 2020 has been dire. You're promising us today positively that 2021, possibly with a vaccine in the first quarter for emergency use, the world will be a better place. Am I correct?
Definitely, we can cancel 2020, but I think the most important thing is that we have an even better way to think about the next pandemic. And I hope that we will use all our learnings from this pandemic to build better.
Professor Kang, it's been fascinating listening to you. I hope that our viewers have been enlightened, because we keep getting all these stories about vaccines almost on a daily basis. You put it all in context. I appreciate you joining us and giving us your knowledge, the benefit of your knowledge on the show. Thank you so much for joining me here on the News Today. News without the noise.